Good morning. I recently received the following email from a constituent of mine in Calgary, Lougheed. Michael wrote the following, quotes, "I have not had a full-time job in over 2 years. I have a wife and kids, no health or dental coverage, no cash left, and zero RRSP or pension funds, as I've had to drain this out just to survive. I can't compete for roles in my professional field of project controls, as there is no capital investment at all and zero opportunity to change career paths when hundreds of people with experience apply to every position. Over half of our people are broke and looking at poverty and economic ruin in the new normal," unquote. That is the reality being lived today by tens and tens of thousands of Albertans and other Canadians across the country. That is a reality that yesterday's throne speech and address from the Prime Minister completely failed to recognize, to acknowledge, or to act on. Yesterday's throne speech included 6,783 words. Not one of them was about the largest industry sector in the Canadian economy. Not one of them mentioned our oil and gas sector, which helped to pull Canada through the last global recession. Not one word recognizing the crisis in that sector and in energy-producing provinces like Alberta. Not one word about fairness in the Federation, about Western alienation, about creating real jobs right now as the central focus of governments across Canada. Last week, I was in Ottawa with premiers representing a consensus of all 13 provinces and territories, calling on the federal government in the throne speech to focus on two key priorities, on health and the economy and jobs. We also asked for action to show fairness in the Federation through reform of the Fiscal Stabilization Program. These issues were not addressed in yesterday's throne speech. There was space for every bright, shiny object, every possible political distraction. Kooky academic theories like intersectionality found their way into yesterday's throne speech, but not one word about health transfers for the provinces that are carrying 80% of the costs as our population ages and we cope with a pandemic. Yesterday's throne speech presented endless policies that would actually further hammer the largest sector of the Canadian economy, like the clean fuel standards. No recognition that what the federal government must do at this point is first to do no harm. All we are asking of the Government of Canada is to let this province and our resource industries to get off their knees, to get back onto our feet during this, the largest economic contraction since the Great Depression. Yesterday's speech reflected a total lack of understanding about the economic crisis through which we are living as a country. It was a fantasy plan for a mythical country that only exists apparently in the minds of Ottawa Liberals and like-minded Laurentian elites, that forgets about the regions and the resource workers who have been the motor of Canadian prosperity in recent decades. The oil and gas industry, the largest export industry of the Canadian economy, typically exporting $100 billion of value every year. We're never going to export $100 billion or a fraction of that in wind and solar-generated electricity. This is the largest export industry that is critical to our balance of payment, to our national wealth. It generates 20% of the Government of Canada's revenues. It employs 500,000 Canadians. The energy industry more broadly it supports 800,000 jobs directly and indirectly. And all we saw yesterday was a repetition of a litany of policies that would further damage that industry at a time of critical need. Let us remember that the Canadian energy sector has been the great engine of social mobility in this country during a time of economic change in recent decades, when many workers in other parts of the country didn't have the benefit of post-secondary education, but had good jobs, lost those jobs in the traditional manufacturing sector, in the East Coast fishery, in the BC forestry, and in other industries, and tens, hundreds of thousands of them moved to Alberta for opportunity over the past 4 decades, making good incomes, being able to take care of their families, and in many cases, being able to start new businesses and enjoy the thrill of opportunity. It is important that we remember, during the global financial crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, the last major global economic downturn, the Canadian energy sector pulled this country through that crisis with less damage than any other major developed economy. And it was in part thanks to the generous transfers emanated by the responsible development of our resources here that we have not only been able to support the economy of other parts of the country, but also the social programs, the healthcare, the infrastructure, and education, with a net fiscal contribution of over $630 billion coming from Albertans through their federal taxes since 1960, and even in recent tough years, an average net annual fiscal contribution of $20 billion a year. A strong Canada needs a strong Alberta, and Alberta was not recognized in yesterday's throne speech with the one passing reference about effectively phasing out the energy sector. Yesterday's throne speech outlined future tax incentives for companies that invest in net zero carbon technology, but zero reference to the companies that are actually doing the major heavy lifting and investing in green technology with the support of Alberta's government. That is our cutting-edge oil and gas companies that are doing remarkable things to reduce carbon intensity and to show real practical environmental progress as opposed to costly pie-in-the-sky schemes. But it's not just about oil and gas. It's about the damage being inflicted to resource industries broadly and to the women and men who work in them. The federal bill C-69, no, we have been pleading with the federal government to go back to the drawing board, to listen to virtually every industry group in the country, to listen to the Senate of Canada, and to make major amendments that undo the damage and uncertainty created by the No More Pipelines law. They've disregarded that, and in the last few months, we have seen the federal government reach into our provincial jurisdiction to create great investor uncertainty by committing to federal environmental reviews on 3 mines here in Alberta that had been under provincial environmental jurisdictional authority. And that is the canary in the coal mine of where they are going to be going in terms of disrupting the Canadian mining industry. A commitment in yesterday's throne speech to sterilize 25% of the landmass in Canada. We here in Alberta are proud of our record of protecting conservation areas within our province. But the implications for the forestry industry and the women and men who work in it of a federal intervention to sterilize enormous amounts of the forestable land in this province are potentially devastating, and by the way, would be counterproductive in terms of properly managing our forests to protect the global environment. The clean fuel standard commitment in the legislation, in the throne speech yesterday, here our government is doing everything we humanly can to attract new investment, to create jobs in this province through diversification and value-add projects, like, for example, major petrochemical projects and expansion of fertilizer plants in this province to help produce greater agricultural yields here and around the world. We've been in conversations with global companies, some of them Canadian, some of them from abroad, who have been looking at collectively tens of billions of dollars of capital investment that would create tens of thousands of construction jobs and thousands of high-paying operating jobs in areas like petrochemicals and fertilizer production. But all of those companies are now telling us that those potential investments would be jeopardized if the federal government proceeds with the current policy direction on clean fuel standards and other issues reiterated in yesterday's throne speech. Those are trade-exposed industries. If we don't produce petrochemical products in Alberta, if we don't produce fertilizers here, they will be produced elsewhere to support global demand. Just like our energy sector, if we don't produce those products here, then we will be giving a monopoly to OPEC dictatorships. You know, it's important for governments to pivot. I was a member of Stephen Harper's government that didn't believe, as a matter of political philosophy, in protecting or intervening to support individual sectors or companies. And yet, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, we saw the potential total collapse of the Canadian automobile manufacturing sector that could have led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs in central Canada and the flight of the entire automotive industry to the United States because of American support. And so I recall the Conservative Harper government made the difficult, counterintuitive decision to pivot away from what our natural political instinct would have been, to provide short-term support, to build a bridge so the auto industry could survive and protect hundreds of thousands of good-paying Canadian manufacturing jobs. The point is, yesterday, the Government of Canada had an opportunity to pivot to the reality of the largest global economic contraction since the 1930s and the reality of the largest decline in energy prices in history, in absolute terms, in a country where that is the largest sector of the economy. They failed to pivot. That throne speech was filled with, as I say, endless distractions and bright, shiny objects, and was not focused on the central imperative that should unite leaders across partisan and geographic lines, which is protecting lives and livelihoods, as the Premier said last week. Finally, yesterday's throne speech represented a full frontal attack on Canadian federalism, on the Constitution of Canada, on provincial jurisdiction. There are more policies that would invade provincial jurisdiction than I could count. And a number of policies that embedded in that throne speech and in the federal government's program, which would constitute, in our view, de facto constitutional amendments without actually going through the constitutional amendment formula. These are very serious issues about the life of the Canadian Federation. I regret that the federal government so spectacularly failed the mark yesterday. I will be speaking with my colleagues, the premiers of the other provinces and territories, later today about the speech from the throne and the Prime Minister's address, and we'll be issuing a communiqué today or tomorrow collectively. I know that many of my provincial colleagues share many aspects of our disappointment. Alberta will continue to work with our allies across the country to focus on lives and livelihoods, to focus on health care and jobs in the economy. We will continue to use every tool at our disposal to defend the vital economic interests of our province, just as we are doing this week at the Supreme Court, supporting our appeal on the carbon tax reference, a issue that we won on a 4-to-1 decision at the Alberta Court of Appeal. And next week, we expect to be back at that court defending Alberta jobs and exclusive constitutional jurisdiction to regulate the production of resources through our constitutional reference on the federal No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69. Regrettably, the federal government proceeds with the legislative agenda outlined yesterday. There will be many more constitutional challenges, and I have every expectation that other provinces will be joining us in those.